The projector hummed, casting my most private terrors onto the courthouse wall for everyone to see. My trembling voice, confessing to a ghost that wasn't there, echoed from Sarah's phone. A murmur swept through the room, then silence, thick and judgmental. I was a spectacle, stripped bare. Sarah, across the aisle, smoothed her skirt. "He's clearly unfit," she stated, her voice calm, almost clinical. The fluorescent lights of Walter Reed Army Medical Center hummed above Mark Jensen's bed, a constant, low thrum that replaced the distant hum of rotors he'd grown accustomed to. His left leg, rebuilt with titanium and grit, lay heavy beneath the sheet, a permanent ache in his hip. A Purple Heart citation, framed by his bedside, was another marker of his third Afghanistan deployment, a tour that had ended with dust and shrapnel in Kandahar. Sleep offered no true escape. The nights brought back the ghosts, not just of his fallen comrades, but the echo of rounds, the smell of burnt cordite, the chilling silence after an explosion. He would wake, sometimes bolt upright, sometimes covered in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The words for what he'd seen, for what he felt, often caught in his throat, thick and unformed. Most people looked at him with a pity he couldn't stomach, or a hero worship that felt like a lie. Then came Sarah Davis. She volunteered with Homes for Heroes, pushing a cart of donated books and puzzles through the ward. Her long brown hair was always pulled back in a neat, practical bun, occasionally escaping in wisps around her temples. Her green eyes held a gaze that felt different. She didn't flinch when he stared or offer hollow platitudes. She just listened. One afternoon, he found himself recounting a fragment of a memory, the sound of sand crunching under boots. He trailed off, embarrassed. Sarah simply nodded, placing a hand gently on his wrist. "It's okay not to be okay, Mark," she said, her voice quiet but steady, a sound he hadn't realized he craved. Their conversations became more frequent. She never pressed, but she was always there, an unshakable presence. She made him feel less broken, less like a problem. 6 months after his discharge, despite the quiet concerns from his unit members about moving too fast, he married her. Sergeant Miller had pulled him aside before the small ceremony. "You're still young, Mark. A man like you needs a reliable partner, someone who understands." Mark had brushed it off, certain he understood Sarah perfectly. He wanted to believe she was the steady ground he desperately needed. They found a small 2-bedroom rental house outside Fort Benning, Georgia. The air was thick with humidity, a far cry from the dry, Midwest winters of his youth. Mark took a training position on base, teaching tactics to fresh recruits. No more deployments, no more waking up to the threat of IEDs. He thought the change of scenery, the routine of civilian life, would quiet the static in his head. It didn't. The nightmares persisted, sometimes intensifying. He'd thrash, kick, sometimes even yell out in his sleep. One morning, Sarah's left arm bore a faint purple bruise, just above the elbow. He hadn't meant to do it. He'd woken up tangled in the sheets, his body rigid, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. Sarah had simply said, It's all right, Mark, just a bad dream." She covered it with a long-sleeve shirt that day. Then she started bringing out a small digital recorder. "It's for my work, Mark," she'd explain one evening, her fingers fiddling with the device. "For PTSD awareness. Your stories, your experience, they could help so many veterans understand they're not alone." He believed her. He sat on the worn floral couch in their living room, talking into the tiny microphone, recounting the broken fragments of his memory, the fear, the anger, the sudden bursts of adrenaline that still shook his hands. He talked about the sounds of the choppers, the dust, the faces of men he couldn't save. He thought he was opening up, trusting her with his deepest wounds. He didn't notice how often she brought out her phone when he was at his lowest. When he was sitting on the floor in the dim light of dawn, staring blankly, feeling the crawl of anxiety. Or when his hands shook so bad he couldn't hold a cup of coffee steady. She'd snap a quick photo, the flash muted, the click barely audible. Unkempt, vacant-eyed, lost. Pictures he never saw. He just kept talking, pouring out his shattered self, convinced she was the one who could help him put it all back together. One April night, the rain came down in sheets, drumming a relentless rhythm on the thin roof of their rental house. Thunder boomed, not distant rumblings, but sharp, concussive cracks that vibrated through the floorboards, reminding Mark too much of something else. He was trying to read, the words blurring on the page. Suddenly, the front door crashed open, letting in a gust of wet wind and a spray of cold water. Sarah stumbled inside, her clothes plastered to her body, hair escaping her bun and sticking to her face. Her chest heaved, and her eyes were wide, darting around the small living room. "They're coming for you, Mark," she cried, her voice a raw whisper, barely audible over the storm. She pressed herself against the door, fumbling to lock it. Her hands trembled. Mark dropped his book, the thud loud in the sudden silence that followed the last clap of thunder. His heart lurched, a familiar surge of adrenaline. "Who? What are you talking about?" He started to rise, his instincts overriding the limp in his left leg. "Operation Shadowfall," she choked out, her voice breaking. The name hit him like a physical blow, colder than the rain still dripping from her hair. He knew that name, a classified operation, deep in a nameless valley, a mission that haunted his darkest nightmares. His hand, without conscious thought, shot to the bedside table where he kept his .45. The cold steel felt familiar, grounding. "What about it?" he demanded. The words clipped, his gaze fixed on her. She pushed herself away from the door, wiping a hand across her wet face. "It's been compromised. A leak. Something about declassification. People, survivors from the compound, they found out. They're coming for everyone involved. For you." Her eyes were desperate, pleading. "They want revenge." He felt a cold dread spread through him, a gut feeling that twisted his stomach. This was the kind of thing they warned you about in intel briefings, the loose ends, the people who slipped through. He gripped the pistol, his knuckles white. "How do you know this?" I heard things," she stammered, "from my contacts, about the PTSD research. They have sources. Trust me, Mark. We have to disappear you, make them think you're dead. It's the only way to stop them." Her voice had a strange urgency, a conviction that cut through his confusion. The plan unfolded too quickly, too smoothly for something so sudden. Sarah had everything ready. Fake IDs appeared from a hidden pocket in her purse. Driver's licenses, social security cards, even a new bank account. She'd already located a remote cabin, she said, in northern Montana, deep in the mountains, a place so isolated it wouldn't even show up on most maps. He was to assume a new name, a new history, a ghost. "We'll tell them you walked into the woods," she explained, her voice calmer now, almost rehearsed. She pulled out a faded snapshot of him from his time at Walter Reed, disheveled and gaunt, taken after a particularly bad night. "Tormented by your demons. You took your pistol and you just kept walking. Never came back." It was a story that, given his recent struggles, would be too easy to believe. A narrative she'd been carefully constructing for months. They drove north that night, through the rain, past silent towns and darkened fields. Mark kept glancing at her, trying to read her expression, but her face was set, unreadable. The world outside the window was a blur. Hours later, well past midnight, they pulled into a desolate truck stop off I-85. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and stale coffee. A few rigs idled, their engines rumbling softly. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She reached across the console, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed a cheap, prepaid burner phone into his palm. Its plastic felt cool against his skin. "Don't call me. Don't try to find me. It's too dangerous, for both of us, especially for you." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the harsh fluorescent glow of the truck stop lights. One tracked a clean path down her smudged cheek. He watched her go, a stranger walking into the humid darkness, leaving him alone with a new name and a chilling story. For 3 months, Mark lived as Mike, in the small, rough-hewn cabin tucked deep into the Montana wilderness. No internet, no television, just the cheap burner phone Sarah had given him, kept charged by a temperamental generator. His days were stripped down to the bone. Chop wood, hunt what he could, rabbit, squirrel, sometimes a deer if luck was on his side, and check the traps he'd set. Every morning he walked the perimeter of the small clearing, scanning the tree line, listening for anything that didn't belong. Sleep was a restless thing, a shallow doze with one ear always cocked, his body tense. The isolation was a constant, gnawing presence, worse in some ways than any deployment. In the field, he'd had his team, the shared purpose, the knowledge that someone always had his back. Here, there was only the wind in the pines, the rustle of unseen animals, and the slow creep of his own thoughts. He missed the easy banter of the barracks, the taste of a cold beer with the guys after a long day of training, even the structured frustration of dealing with Army bureaucracy. He missed his life. Some days the emptiness became unbearable. He would grab his pack and hike, 10 miles sometimes, pushing his reconstructed leg up steep inclines, through dense underbrush. The burning in his muscles, the sweat on his brow, the sheer physical exertion, it was all he could do to feel something real. Something other than the quiet despair that threatened to settle in his bones. 5 miles down a winding gravel road, past thick stands of lodgepole pine, was the general store. It served as the local post office, grocery, and unofficial community center. The owner, an old man named Gus with a perpetual chew of tobacco in his cheek, called him Mike. Mark would buy supplies, flour, coffee, a few cans of soup, and offer curt nods to the few other locals who sometimes gathered by the pot-bellied stove. He was the quiet, private man, the one who kept to himself. Nobody asked too many questions, and he offered no answers. It suited him. Then winter descended, earlier and more brutally than the locals had predicted. 3 feet of snow fell in the first week of November, blanketing the mountains in a heavy, unforgiving white. The temperatures plummeted, biting at the exposed skin, seeping into the cabin's thin walls. The ache in his left hip, a phantom limb of his Kandahar wound, intensified, a constant throb that pulsed with the dropping mercury. The wood stove, fed endlessly with the logs he'd spent weeks splitting, barely kept the chill at bay, leaving cold pockets in every corner. He thought of Sarah sometimes, of their little house in Georgia, the warmth of their bed. The image was sharp, a painful contrast to his freezing reality. One night, a blizzard roared in, a whiteout that swallowed the cabin in a maelstrom of snow and wind. Around midnight, the old gasoline generator, sputtering valiantly against the cold, coughed its last. Silence, deep and absolute, fell over the cabin. The heat from the stove, already struggling, began to dissipate rapidly. He layered on every piece of clothing he owned, huddling under his thickest sleeping bag, but the cold crept in, insidious and relentless. Sub-zero temperatures quickly permeated the small structure. His injured leg, already stiff from the cold, began to seize up. A sharp, searing pain shot through his hip, paralyzing him. He tried to shift, to stand, but the muscle locked, a vice grip. He lay there shivering, the cold stealing the feeling from his extremities. The thought came to him, clear and stark, that this was it. Dying alone, freezing in a forgotten cabin in the mountains. His perfect disappearance completed. The burner phone clutched in his numb hand gave a final faint beep. The battery indicator winked out. The small screen went black. His last link to Sarah, to any hope of the outside world, was gone. The blizzard finally broke. It took Mark 3 days for the cabin to warm enough, for his leg to ease before he could manage the hike into town. Each step was a dull throb, a constant reminder of the pain and the cold. He went straight to Gus's general store, bought a new burner phone identical to the last, and a handful of dollar store batteries. He slid the SIM card from the old phone into the new one, hoping against hope the number Sarah had programmed was still valid. He punched the button, the generic ringtone piercing the silence of the cabin. A polite, automated voice answered. "We're sorry, the number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service." He tried again. The same message. He sat on the edge of the cot, the phone heavy in his hand, a cold, hard knot forming in his stomach. Disconnected, not out of range, not busy, disconnected. Breaking his promise, he knew he had to. He waited until the next day, until his leg felt a little steadier, and hiked back to town. The small library was quiet, smelling of old paper and dust. The librarian, a woman with tight gray curls and thin spectacles, nodded a silent greeting as he took a seat at one of the public computers. He typed his own name into the search bar. Mark Jensen, Army, Special Forces. The results flooded the screen. An obituary. His obituary. Dated 6 months ago. His chest tightened. There were pictures, a solemn military funeral, a uniformed honor guard, a perfectly folded American flag presented to Sarah, who was dressed in a stark black dress, her face etched with grief. The 21-gun salute he never heard, the mournful notes of taps he'd never witnessed. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. He read the eulogy, a carefully crafted narrative of a brave soldier, a loving husband, lost to the invisible wounds of war. He clicked through the related articles. Sarah Davis, the grieving widow. She was everywhere. On morning talk shows, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, talking about the burden of PTSD on military families. At veterans rallies, her voice strong and clear, calling for more funding, more support. Testifying before a congressional committee, a poised and articulate advocate, her long brown hair now perfectly styled, not the messy bun he remembered. She spoke eloquently about her husband, Mark, who had returned from war a changed man, haunted by what he'd seen, ultimately succumbing to the trauma. She had started a foundation in his name, the Mark Jensen Foundation for Veterans Mental Health. Donations poured in. He saw photos of her shaking hands with senators, celebrities, military brass. His death hadn't just made her a widow, it had made her a national star. A sweetheart advocate, the headlines proclaimed, a beacon of hope for struggling military families. He stared at the screen, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was her way of protecting him, of ensuring the hunters wouldn't look for him. She was doing good work, raising awareness. Maybe his sacrifice, his disappearance, was worth it if it helped other soldiers. He tried to believe it, to push away the creeping doubt. Then he saw another photo, a gala for the foundation. Sarah, radiant in a shimmering gown, standing next to a man he knew. Robert Thompson, his former unit commander. Colonel Thompson, who had personally briefed him on Operation Shadowfall. Thompson was smiling, a comfortable, almost chummy smile, his hand on Sarah's arm. He looked too composed, too relaxed, for a man whose operator was supposedly being hunted by vengeful terrorists. He looked like a man who was perfectly aware of where his operator was, and that he was perfectly safe from any threat. A cold, sickening dread settled in Mark's gut, colder than any Montana winter. It wasn't just Sarah. Thompson was in on it. All of it. The Operation Shadowfall leak, the hunters, the urgent need to disappear. It was a fabrication, a carefully constructed lie. He had been played. The library's fluorescent hum was the only sound as Mark stared at the screen. The image of his funeral, a cold, hard fact. The truth settled over him, not with a rush of anger, but with a slow, chilling clarity. Sarah hadn't just grieved, she had capitalized. His death was her genesis. He closed the browser, pushing himself away from the desk, the ache in his hip momentarily forgotten. He spent the next few weeks making careful, calculated moves. He couldn't risk direct contact, not as a man officially dead, but he had a network, old connections from his Special Forces days, men who owed him, or whom he owed, quiet favors. Using burner phones and encrypted messaging apps, he sent out discreet inquiries. He asked for any chatter, any intelligence, anything at all about Operation Shadowfall being compromised. He asked if there were any whispers of bounties on American soldiers, any specific threats from the region that Sarah had mentioned. The answers, when they came, were uniform. Nothing, not a whisper, no leaks, no bounties, no intelligence suggesting a threat. Operation Shadowfall remained as classified as ever, its secrets locked down tight. The cold dread in his gut solidified into an unshakable certainty. There had been no threat, no vengeful survivors, no reason for him to vanish. Sarah had invented it all. His fake death, the isolated cabin, the terror he'd lived with for months, it was all a calculated performance, designed to clear her path. The immediate urge was to confront her, to tear down the elaborate edifice she'd built on his grave. But Mark held back. He needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal, the layers of her deception. He needed to know how deep it went, who else was involved. A hasty move would accomplish nothing but reveal his existence and likely put him back in a cage. He would watch. He would wait. For the next 2 years, Mark became a ghost in earnest, haunting the edges of Sarah's public life. He watched the Sarah Davis Foundation for Veteran Mental Health grow from a fledgling charity into a multi-million-dollar organization. He saw her on news channels, in magazine profiles, always poised, always articulate, the embodiment of a grieving widow turned tireless advocate. He learned to navigate the dark corners of the internet, finding public records, foundation reports, financial disclosures. The money flowed in, tax-free, and a significant portion flowed out, not always directly to veteran services, but to salaries, to lobbying efforts, to a growing staff. During this time, he deliberately changed his appearance. He let his hair grow out, then darkened it with a cheap dye kit he bought from a discount store. A thick, grizzled beard covered the lean angles of his jaw, making him unremarkable. He practiced walking without his limp, forcing his rebuilt leg to comply, merging into the anonymous crowd. He adopted a new identity, a new name, a new backstory for anyone who cared to ask. He found work as a security consultant, paid in cash, traveling often, staying off the grid as much as possible. He eventually settled in Chicago, drawn by the anonymity of a large city and its Midwestern sensibilities, a subtle nod to the life he'd lost. Sarah, meanwhile, had traded their small Georgia house for a sprawling townhouse in D.C., her life now entwined with senators, cabinet members, and the media elite. In Chicago, Mark rented a small, nondescript apartment in Logan Square, a neighborhood of old brick buildings and quiet tree-lined streets. The apartment was sparse: a bed, a small kitchen table, a few books. He kept to himself, a silent observer in a city of millions. His only regular connection was an elderly Vietnam veteran named Walter Green, who lived in the unit below. Walter, a wiry man with a perpetual tremor in his hands, would sometimes share a cup of coffee on the stoop, talking about old wars and the quiet indignities of aging. Mark mostly listened, stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. Walter Green was a man who understood silence. He sat next to Mark on the rusty fire escape, the city noise a distant murmur below them, a lukewarm beer in his trembling hand. He'd look at Mark sometimes, his old eyes sharp, and Mark knew Walter saw things others didn't. The 1,000-yard stare, Walter called it once, a ghost of recognition in his voice. But he never pressed, never asked about Afghanistan or what Mark had done. They'd talk about the weather, about the queens, about the rising price of groceries, everything but the wars they'd fought. They think the hard part is the fighting, Walter mused one warm evening, watching the last of the sun fade behind the rooftops. All the noise, the adrenaline, the fear. But it's not. The hard part is coming home, or trying to. He took a long swallow of beer. That's where you really get broken, isn't it? When the fight's over and you're supposed to just fit back in. Mark didn't answer, just nodded, the words hitting too close to home. He felt like a ghost, suspended in limbo. Not Mark Jensen, the Special Forces operator, nor entirely the Mike or David Harrington he now pretended to be. Just a hollow space in between. His security consultant job kept him busy enough during the day. It was good, honest work, advising small businesses on vulnerability assessments, setting up surveillance systems, running background checks. It paid the bills in cash and kept him off the grid. But his real work, his meticulous obsession, began after hours. He'd set up a digital dragnet, a sophisticated web of alerts and data mining tools. Every mention of Sarah's name, every press release from the Sarah Davis Foundation, every financial filing, every social media post. It all funneled into his makeshift command center in his small apartment. He studied her public persona, the carefully crafted image of the grieving widow turned tireless advocate. He watched her interviews, analyzing her expressions, the calculated pauses, the glint in her eyes that now seemed less like genuine empathy and more like practiced performance. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Sarah's ambition, he discovered, wasn't a recent development. Records showed a history of involvement in smaller, less successful nonprofits, a pattern of starting things, then moving on when they failed to gain traction. There were hints of carefully planned career moves, a relentless drive for influence and recognition that seemed to predate their marriage. She hadn't stumbled into advocacy, she had orchestrated it. The financial inconsistencies of the foundation were the most damning. Millions of dollars poured in, ostensibly for veteran support programs, but the outflow was often murky. Lavish spending on inflated travel expenses, high-priced consultants who seemed to do little actual work. He found evidence of shell corporations, companies registered to obscure P.O. boxes, receiving large payments from the foundation. These corporations, upon further digging, often led back to individuals with vague, indirect connections to Sarah herself or to her family. The funds, it was clear, were being siphoned, redirected for personal enrichment, disguised within the legitimate framework of a charity. The extent of her manipulation became chillingly clear, sharp, and unforgiving. His trauma, his nightmares, his very real suffering, it hadn't been for awareness. It hadn't been to help other veterans. It was the bedrock, the raw material, the compelling narrative she needed to build her empire. He wasn't a husband she loved and lost. He was a tragic hero, a martyr whose story she could exploit. The pieces clicked into place, forming a mosaic of cold, calculated betrayal. He had been nothing more than a stepping stone. With the truth laid bare, Mark's focus shifted from discovery to systematic documentation. He spent countless hours in his small apartment, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his focused face. Every piece of evidence, the Foundation's murky financial reports, the Shell Corporation filings, the discrepancies in Sarah's public statements versus her private actions, was meticulously cataloged. He cross-referenced dates, followed money trails, and built a damning case of financial fraud. Simultaneously, he compiled the evidence of his own fabricated death, his obituary, Sarah's interviews, the fact that Operation Shadowfall was never compromised, and the damning photograph of Robert Thompson, his former commander, smiling beside Sarah. Breading from his deep cover, Mark began to reach out. He used secure, anonymous channels to contact a handful of lawyers known for their work in white-collar crime, and a few investigative journalists with reputations for integrity and tenacity. He provided them with tantalizing snippets of information, enough to pique their interest, but never enough to expose himself prematurely. He was a puppet master in the shadows, orchestrating the groundwork for Sarah's downfall without revealing his own existence. A quiet moral tension gnawed at him. He knew that exposing Sarah would inevitably shatter the foundation she'd built. Despite its fraudulent core, the Mark Jensen Foundation did do some good. A percentage of the money, however small, genuinely helped veterans, funding a few therapy programs, providing some emergency relief. He wrestled with the thought of destroying those legitimate efforts, those small acts of genuine help, but the sheer scale of her personal enrichment, the callous way she had exploited his death, and the trauma of countless soldiers for her own gain outweighed his hesitation. The fraud was too egregious, the betrayal too profound. He began to craft his master plan, a carefully choreographed reveal. It had to be public, undeniable, and at a moment when Sarah's platform was at its absolute peak. He learned of a prestigious Veterans Gala, a black tie event in Washington, D.C., where Sarah was scheduled to receive a national award for her advocacy work. It was the perfect stage. Using his new identity and the considerable resources he'd discreetly accumulated from his security consultant work, he secured an invitation. He posed as an anonymous, wealthy donor, a reclusive philanthropist interested in supporting veteran causes. The invitation arrived, embossed and official, a thick cardstock ticket to her undoing. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Mark prepared with the same intensity he'd once brought to a mission briefing. He practiced his walk, consciously shedding the slight limp that sometimes reappeared with fatigue. He worked on his posture, the way he would carry himself, confident, controlled, unyielding. He stared at his reflection, studying the face in the mirror, the new beard, the darker hair, ensuring no trace of the Mark Jensen she had buried remained. His gaze would have to be unwavering when their eyes finally met. He made sure the key players were in place. The lawyers he'd briefed, the investigative journalists he'd fed information to. He ensured they would be present, guests of other anonymous donors, ready to witness the spectacle. He prepared a concise statement, a few damning sentences that would cut through the glitz and expose the truth. He had printed copies of his irrefutable proof, a carefully bound dossier, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. The weight of his lost identity, the 2 years of living as a ghost, the impending confrontation. It all bore down on him, but his resolve was ironclad. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming himself, about justice for the lie she had so skillfully woven. The ballroom of the Grand Hyatt was a symphony of hushed conversations, clinking glasses, and the soft glow of chandeliers. Tonight, Sarah Davis was the star, radiant in a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the stage lights. She stood at the podium, a framed award waiting to be presented beside her, delivering her acceptance speech with the practiced grace of a seasoned orator. Her voice, smooth and confident, filled the hall, speaking of the invisible burdens of war, of the sacrifices made of her beloved husband, Mark, who couldn't bear the weight of what he'd seen. Her eyes glistened with what appeared to be genuine sorrow, a subtle catch in her throat expertly timed. The audience, a mix of dignitaries, veterans, and wealthy donors, hung on her every word. Mark watched from the rear entrance, his presence a stark contrast to the glittering backdrop. He wore his dress uniform, impeccably pressed, the medals on his chest catching the light, a purple heart, a bronze star, the ribbons of a life she had declared over. His beard was gone, his hair trimmed, and the years of isolation had etched new lines around his eyes, but his gaze was unwavering. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the banquet hall, a silent, living specter. Heads began to turn, a ripple of unease moving through the crowd. He ignored them, his focus singular. He saw her then, up on the stage, her profile illuminated. He kept walking, the soft thud of his polished dress shoes on the thick carpet a barely audible counterpoint to her flowing words. He felt the cold weight of the dossier in his inner jacket pocket, the irrefutable truth. When their eyes finally met across the crowded room, the distance between them felt like a chasm. He saw the flash of recognition, then disbelief, then pure, unadulterated terror in her eyes. It was like watching a movie frame by frame. Her mouth, mid-word, froze. Her confident posture stiffened. A collective gasp, soft at first, then louder, rippled through the audience. Sarah's face, which a moment before had been glowing, drained to an ashen white. She clutched her chest, her hand trembling. Her public facade, so carefully constructed over 2 years, crumbled. Her knees buckled, and she pitched forward, collapsing onto the stage with a soft thud that was surprisingly loud in the sudden, stunned silence. The hall erupted in murmurs and shouts. People surged from their tables. A few hurried towards the stage. Uniformed medics, stationed discreetly for such a high-profile event, rushed forward, pushing through the confusion to reach Sarah. Mark remained standing, allowing the shock to spread, allowing the scene to unfold. He was a silent accusation, his presence enough to shatter her world. Then he took another step forward. His voice, clear and resonant, cut through the rising clamor, amplified by the sudden silence that fell as people turned towards him. "My name is Mark Jensen," he declared, his words echoing off the high ceiling, "and I am not dead." He reached into his jacket, pulled out the dossier, and held it up. "My disappearance, my supposed death, was a calculated lie, an elaborate fraud orchestrated by Sarah Davis to build her empire." He saw the faces of the investigative journalists he'd tipped off, their eyes wide, their recorders already extended. The lawyers he'd contacted nodded almost imperceptibly. The flashbulbs began to pop, a blinding white light that filled the hall. Reporters, already present for the gala, swarmed, shouting questions. The chaos was immediate, overwhelming. Sarah, now being tended to by medics, was completely forgotten in the frenzied realization that a ghost had walked into the room, not to haunt, but to expose. Sarah was rushed from the gala, her public life and meticulously constructed reputation shattered beyond repair. The Mark Jensen Foundation faced immediate federal investigation. Within weeks, auditors uncovered widespread financial fraud and embezzlement, revealing millions siphoned off for personal enrichment. Mark cooperated fully with authorities, providing his comprehensive dossier, detailing Sarah's calculated manipulation from their early days in Walter Reed. Public opinion turned violently against her. America's sweetheart became its most reviled pariah. She faced multiple criminal charges, her elaborate web of lies unraveling in excruciating public detail. Mark, no longer a ghost, grappled with his newfound visibility, beginning the arduous process of reclaiming his identity. He addressed the press, speaking honestly about his PTSD and the profound, calculated betrayal he endured. His story became a cautionary tale, prompting difficult discussions about ethics, ambition, and the true cost of deceit. He began therapy, confronting the trauma of his fake death and Sarah's treachery, seeking genuine healing. He found a new purpose, perhaps working quietly with honest veteran organizations, slowly building a real life, finally at peace. The chaos at the Gala settled into a grim clarity. Sarah was indeed rushed to the hospital, her career and pristine reputation collapsing the moment I spoke my name. The foundation, her multi-million-dollar empire built on my fabricated death, was immediately put under federal investigation. It didn't take long for the auditors to uncover the widespread fraud and embezzlement, confirming every suspicion I had carefully documented. I cooperated fully with the authorities, providing a comprehensive narrative of her manipulation, from our first meetings at Walter Reed to her calculated staging of my disappearance. Public opinion, once adoring, turned brutally against Sarah, transforming her from America's sweetheart advocate into its pariah. She faced criminal charges, her web of lies unraveling in excruciating public detail. No longer a ghost, I slowly grappled with my new, unwelcome visibility, learning to navigate the world as a man returned from the dead. I addressed the press, speaking honestly about my PTSD and the profound betrayal I had endured. My story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the true cost of ambition and deceit. I started therapy, a long, difficult process of working through the trauma of my fake death and Sarah's treachery. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to build a real life, perhaps even finding a new purpose working with honest veteran organizations. There was no grand triumph, just the quiet, enduring work of putting myself back together, one steady step at a time.